3D printable battle mechs. Well, to be fair, 3D printable American mecha is a thing, and we're going to talk about it. And this would be the 3D printed mech we're looking at here today. On its product listing, it is referred to as the Mad Rampager, in particular the Mad-3R variant. Of course, this is obviously just a Marauder, and that particular version is the 3025 kind of standard version with the dual standard PPCs, dual medium lasers, and your run-of-the-mill normal autocannon 5 up here. When it comes to this particular miniature, I got it off my mini factory by searching for mech. It is produced by somebody who goes by the name White Rook Studios. That's White Rook as in the chess piece. And for this particular figure, I found it on the website. I purchased it myself, and I have had no communications with the designer, so this is not any sort of paid review or paid promotional thing whatsoever. For this particular designer, they do not provide any pre-supported miniatures, at least with the Marauder it was not pre-supported. So you're going to have to go ahead and add supports yourself, which frankly used to be a really painful process. I printed this guy up on my Prusa SL1 using Prusa's default slicer, and it's actually getting pretty good at just automatically adding supports. It was able to find all the islands, and it got that nailed perfectly. I just went in and added some more supports where I thought it, well, kind of needed them. Things looked a bit shaky, but it's a much faster job these days for adding supports than it was way back in the day. So having a non-pre-supported model is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when I talked about it last time with these miniatures where, well, their supports just didn't even work for me. When it comes to the design, well, let me slide the official Marauder miniature over here. There's definitely quite a few similarities, but it's not an exact copy. It's kind of a combination of the standard Marauder here from the actual official Battletech miniature line, as well as it's got some elements of the MechWarrior Online version of the Marauder. And you can kind of see both of those inspirations if you look really close at this miniature. Now there's two annoyances I kind of want to point out, just so you're aware of them. With having a one-piece miniature, which this one is, in a lot of cases that's a good thing when it comes to 3D printing. I know having multi-piece SLA printed miniatures kind of causes some angst and some stress for people. But with the battle mech anyway, trying to get all the supports cleaned up in here underneath the torso and in the legs and stuff, it can be messy and difficult. So you're going to end up with some kind of just garbled damage down there like I've got, unless you're really good at refining your support method to where you know how to create the supports that break away really easily. One of the things I do want to point out with this particular miniature that could be an issue is that some of the details are really small and they're really shallow and very hard to see. In particular, I want to focus on right here the knee joint. There's sort of like a screw or bolt head type thing that's there. And the problem you run into when it comes to very shallow, very hard to see details is that when you go ahead to paint the miniature, the actual pigment from the paints, even though miniature pigment paints is really, really tiny, it can fill in those small details and obfuscate them pretty well. If you compare that to pretty much any actual miniature, for example, once again, the Marauder right here, the details of the miniatures are going to be fairly exaggerated compared to the actual scale of the miniature. Therefore, anything you want to be a recess or anything you want to look cool is actually going to be bigger than it really should be if you were to scale this mech up into its proper size in real life. That way, once your eyes can see the detail, and two, also then when you go to paint the miniature, you're not going to obfuscate and hide some of the details. I've ran into that with some games in the past where the details are so small that if you're not really careful, you lose all of them by the time you're done applying your 10 layers of paint to your well-painted miniature. And of course, people are going to start asking, well, isn't this some sort of copyright violation? And frankly, that is a question for the courts, and I naturally picked the Marauder because this thing exists. Now, if you're new to Battletech, you may be wondering why I went ahead and just put a Robotech figure on the table. But if you go back to the early days of the game, for about 10 years or so, let me slide the 3D printing guy out of the way, this miniature right here, this was the Marauder. because when the game was first launched back in the 80s, FASA went ahead and licensed some of the visual appearances of some of the Robotech Mecha to be the initial set of Battletech mechs. However, flash forward a while and you get into a situation where another company claimed that they did not license them properly, and there's a big lawsuit over it. And that whole legal situation was settled out of court, so we never really found out exactly what the ramifications of it were. But Battletech's response was to get rid of all these Robotech-based mechs, along with some other third-party designed mechs. They're now called the Unseen mechs, and they officially don't exist anymore. And for a while, all we had were really ugly-looking Marauders. Think the Bounty Hunter mech from the MechWarrior Dark Age game. And then when Catalyst Game Labs redesigned their plastic miniature line for the new age of Battletech, you got something that, frankly, well, it's obviously a different mech, but there's plenty of clear basic silhouettes and similarities to it that, as far as I can tell, they haven't been sued over this guy yet. Maybe there's some sort of weird legal agreement back from the lawsuit that's keeping that from happening, but no one has came after Catalyst Game Labs for this particular version of the Marauder. So if I bring the 3D printed guy back in here, you can see the same kind of a situation. Yeah, the basic shape is there, but there's a whole lot of details that are different. And it would be up to a court case to decide if it's copyright infringement or not. And then for the time being, that would be Fanatics who would have to file the copyright case. And to be honest with you, there's always a chance that could backfire on them if the end result is that this is substantially different enough to not infringe on their copyrights. And from a practical perspective, right now, Fanatics, considering that Battletech is such a tiny, well, we can assume based on various estimations that Battletech is a very tiny percentage of their revenue. They probably just don't care. Well, we're back in the studio here, and we're going to answer the question whether 3D printed Battletech is really worth it for you, and there are several things to consider. Let's start with the financial side of things. Now, with White Rook Studios, each set of STL files, and I'll talk a little bit more about the details of that, cost around $10 for this. Whereas when compared to Catalyst Game Labs' official Battle Mechs, depending on which one you get from which set, it's about $7.50 to $8.50 per mech. Of course, though, with all the different Battletech options out there, for the most part, with the exception of like the Urban Mech where you get like a whole bunch of them, you generally have to get the mech you want alongside anywhere between 3 to 5 other mechs, which maybe you may or may not want. Now, I find for the most part with Battletech, I think with most mechs, I'm fine with having only one of. I generally don't want more than one, but there are some exceptions, like the Marauder, or my other favorite mech, the Catapult, which from Battletech is currently only available in a $50 set, and I don't really want the rest of the mechs in that set. So there are circumstances where I think buying the STL files, along with fiddling with the 3D printer, adding supports, removing supports, and all the annoyance that comes with resin 3D printing, it may be worth it to buy an STL version of the mech versus buying a whole bunch of the actual official Catalyst Game Labs miniatures, but I think that would be the exception when it comes to the financial side of things. Now, on a different topic, there is the whole idea of ideology, and that may want to drive you one way or another. Of course, when you get into Battletech, you get in the topic of wokeness and how they're taking the game in certain political directions and the company in certain political directions, and maybe you want to have nothing to do with that, but you still want to enjoy Battletech. Maybe you could look to other third-party designers for miniatures. In particular, I don't know who White Rook Studios really is, but they may be based. And why do I say that? Well, one of the names of one of their third-party mechs is a dead naming joke. And that is something that woke people would not do and are absolutely terrified of doing. So it's possible that an ideological thing like that may drive somebody one way or the other, irregardless of the financial situation involved with that particular purchase. Now, at least when it comes to White Rook Studios, there is one more really important advantage, and I mentioned a little bit about it just a moment ago, in that this is a set of STL files, files being plural. Instead of just getting a single mech, most of their sets have a number of variants to them. Let me jump over to Blender here where I imported all the STL files that I got when I purchased this Mad Rampager. And what you're going to see is if you look at the top weapon, as well as sometimes some of the arm-mounted weapons, they're actually different. So here's one option right there. Of course, you've got a different gun up here, as well as you've got a different weapon down here in the arm. And you can see that across some of the other variants, there's different weapons, as well as other little details, like the shoulder armor detail here does vary from variant to variant. And that is a really strong argument for going down the STL route, because Catalyst Game Labs, for the most part, does not produce any of the variant mechs for their miniatures. Now, with most of the variants, doesn't really make that big of a difference. You can kind of use whatever, version of the mech you want. But sometimes with things like the catapult, where you have the missile variant, you have the artillery variant, you have the gun variant, there is a huge visual difference between those variants, and you may want to represent them as such on the battlefield. And jumping back to the STL files here in Blender, if you really wanted to, and you have a little bit of Blender experience, it doesn't look too difficult to go into here and kind of chop things up and repose the mech if you wanted to do that, or if you wanted to break off individual pieces for the mech just to 3D print like an arm or a leg, because that brings me to the next advantage that STL files have, which is that you can do other things with them than just use them as a gaming miniature. Now, sure, I could take an official Catalyst Game Labs miniature here, break it into lots of little pieces, and make it into a terrain piece or an objective marker, but that seems like a little bit more of a waste of money when compared to printing out some of the STL miniatures, because it's a lot easier to do that, and at least in my head, it feels like a better use of resources to trash something that I printed for 50 cents than something I bought for $7 or $8. And in fact, the first time I printed this mech off, I got a little bit overzealous when it came to removing the support material, and I did break some things off. So I went ahead and actually trashed one of these Marauder miniatures, and I might go ahead and turn that into an objective marker in the not too distant future for a tutorial here on this channel. So let me know in the comments if you would want to see something like that. Well, that is about all I have to say at this time when it comes to talking about 3D printed mechs versus the official gaming miniatures. And if you got some other designer out there who sells 3D printable mechs and want me to take a look at them, go ahead and give me that information in the comments. Just give me the name and kind of where I can find them. Don't put a link. That sometimes makes YouTube cranky. So if I just have the name and the website without a link format to where I can find them, I can go ahead and dig that up myself. So thank you guys all for watching. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield, and of course if you're watching this video, you are probably a fan of 3D printing, and at the time I'm recording this particular one, I am just finishing up the fulfillment of my latest crowdfunding campaign for my line of 3D printable gaming miniatures, Fractured Colony. So therefore, in the not too distant future, if you missed out on that crowdfunding project, yes, crowdfunding project, thank you brain, you'll be able to go ahead and purchase the STL files over at fracturedcolony.com in the coming few weeks. So with that, I already said thank you guys for watching, but I sometimes say that twice. Anyway, I'll see you guys all next time.